Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are so excited about what we're going to cover today. This is a long-awaited group of folks coming together to talk about questions that we get quite a bit, which is scope 3 rebaselining, also known as restating your base year, resetting your baseline. However we say it, we like to talk about it a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in. We've got lots of people still joining on the line. Today we are going to go through looking at rebaselining from a couple of different angles. So we are starting out with the folks from SBTi, sort of covering the basics, the foundational information about how and when and to whom you should be restating your base year. We'll then come over to some common sort of food and bev industry specific use cases, scenarios. We'll walk through to really sort of like make it tangible and make it relevant to the kind of work that you all are doing every day. Then head over to sort of how to approach rebaselining. So you have all this information. What do you do with it? Where do you go next? And then, as always, we'll have lots of time for Q&A. I'll start out with some specific questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Please don't be shy. Ask all of the questions that you like, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We've got an incredible group here with us today, and we are so grateful to have Science-Based Targets Initiative on the line. So we're going to start out with Kyra Power, who will open up the webinar for us today. We'll then go over to my colleagues, Rachel Colomani, our SVP of Growth and Innovation at HowGood. And then at the end, we'll open up Q&A, bring on some more technical folks into the group with Arthur Gillette and Iman Aitaisa. They'll answer all of the questions that you have about rebaselining. And yeah, we'll get to as many as we can. With that, we are going to go ahead and get started. Kyra, I will pass it over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you for having me here today. It's really great to be here. So yes, I'm here to give an overview of essentially what the SBTi requires in terms of companies needing to rebaseline and kind of what we require in terms of when you need to do that, why you might need to do that, and then what you need to do in terms of communicating that back to your stakeholders or the SBTi. Okay, so first, I just want to set the kind of overall requirements in terms of what scenarios could trigger a baseline update. So first, I think there are those that are structural in nature. For example, mergers and acquisitions that result in the company assuming responsibility for emissions not previously in the inventory. This could also look like a divestment in which a company relinquishes responsibility over emissions in the inventory. Second are those that are methodological in nature. So those result in a change in methodology, which I believe will be the primary focus of today's session. For example, moving from modeled data to primary data. So I'm going to call out just one very important note here on this slide. The SBTi in our cross-sector guidance, or our corporate net zero standard, and our near-term criteria, we require companies to rebaseline when overall changes to the inventory result in a change of 5% or more. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has some additional requirements in terms of companies maintaining a rebaselining policy and developing their own significance thresholds if appropriate. But the SBTi, we really maintain that 5% or more threshold. And I can walk you through a bit of what that looks like when applied to certain parts of the inventory and how that affects targets. So if we can move to the next slide. So in the case that changes are deemed significant, again, they meet that 5% or more threshold, the next step a company would take is to essentially map those changes to the existing target to understand how changes actually impact the target's validity. So this is actually where a lot of companies get confused. I have a lot of companies that come to my inbox asking for clarity on this topic. And they usually assume that any rebaselining, any change in the inventory automatically results in a target recalculation and update. But that is actually not always the case. So how do you know if rebaselining requires a target recalculation and formal revalidation with the SBTi? In short, if the changes in the inventory cause the target to no longer meet SBTi's criteria. So there are really three things that companies should watch out for here. The first is if the target boundary is affected. So a change of 5% or more in the base year emissions covered within a target boundary. So there's two 5% significant thresholds. One triggers the rebaseline. So that's over the entire inventory. So if, again, that change of 5% across the inventory, that's what triggers the rebaseline. And then there's an additional 5% significant threshold. This applies to the target boundary. So if 5% of emissions change within a target boundary, for example, a company with a scope 1 and 2 target covering 95% of scope 1 and 2 emissions, if emissions across scope 1 and 2 change significantly enough that that target no longer meets the 95% threshold, then a recalculation and revalidation would be triggered. So next is target coverage. That's what I just started going into, but that's essentially if the changes result in the target coverage dipping below SBTi's minimum requirements. So in the cross-sector standard, that's 95% coverage for scope 1 and 2 emissions. 67% of scope 3 emissions should be covered by a target. Again, this is our cross-sector standards. So if scope 3 was to change significantly to go under 67%, that would also trigger that target recalculation and revalidation. Next is target ambition. So companies using a sector-specific methodology should check if their ambition is still valid when applied to the new base year inventory by entering their updated data into the relevant SBTi target setting tool. So essentially, if the ambition line from that updated base year and the existing target year falls below the required rate of reduction, then the target is no longer valid. That's when we're triggering a recalculation and revalidation. So importantly, in the case that the company determines that the target is still valid with the updated base year emissions, then no further action is required in terms of the SBTi. So they do not need to go forth for a formal revalidation. We just require that companies disclose the updated base year in their next reporting cycle. So what happens in the case that a company's target is no longer valid? So you've gone through this exercise, you've remapped your target, you realize, oh no, the coverage is not correct, the boundaries changed significantly, my ambition is now off, etc. Okay, so this is when we go into target recalculation and pursuing a formal revalidation with the SBTi. In this case, companies would need to officially update their target. So that looks like kind of redeveloping the target based on the new base year emissions and submit those back to the SBTi, recalculating those targets with new data. We always recommend that companies communicate these types of changes transparently to stakeholders. So indicating the reason for the update, any kind of substantiating details, etc. And then the company's updated targets would then display on the SBTi target dashboard upon the update, and they can explain that to their stakeholders, and their kind of next general target progress update. So quickly, let's look through just an example of a company. So let's say that a company begins to apply more supplier-specific data in scope 3. So as you can see, if you're kind of looking across, I know this is a lot of words on one slide, but if you're looking across, you have the original inventory and then the reflected changes in the inventory. So category 1 maybe have decreased. However, several other categories increased as a result of this new, more granular data. So the result of the cumulative changes on the left side in that updated base year inventory is that the emissions coverage no longer meets the 67% threshold required by SBTi's criteria. So in this example, a target revalidation would be required because the target no longer meets our criteria. In the case that a company updates base year figures and the result is that the total target coverage still meets or exceeds that 67% threshold, then no target update would be required. The company can simply disclose the updated base year during the next reporting cycle, and there's no interaction required with the SBTi for that. Okay, so I hope that helps everyone just be a little bit more clear on what's required from the SBTi side, on when and why rebaselining should be undertaken by a company. And I'm now going to hand it back over to the HowGood team to take us through a few concrete examples relevant to this group.
Thanks, Kyra. It's almost like being on with royalty. We really appreciate all that great information. So you just heard the rules. Let's spend the next 10 minutes or so on what that actually looks like when they land in your inventory. Before we dive in, though, let me quickly introduce HowGood, the team behind the world's largest food ingredient sustainability database and our platform, Lattice. We help brands with product carbon footprinting, supplier engagement, and actually reducing emissions across those brands' supply chain. My name's Rachel Calamini, and I'm part of the HowGood team. All right, so let's jump in. We've pulled together 4 scenarios here. These aren't hypothetical. They're things that you're probably already dealing with or will be in the next 12 to 18 months. We're going to walk through each one, and then I'll show you the framework that classifies all of them. Let's start with the most common one. In this one, a CPG acquires a snack brand. It adds 17% to their corporate inventory. But more importantly, the acquired company sources palm oil from regions that the parent company had never touched before. Now, they've got new geographies, new suppliers, and a brand new 20-year DLUC look-back period to work through. I'm starting here because this is actually the easy one to classify, even though operationally the work is hard. The company itself is changed and the boundary moved. This is a structural event, not a methodology one. SBTi has given clean guidance on it. Full inventory recalculation, not just scope 3.1. Restate the base year, note the effective date. Where companies can get into trouble here is timing. They assume that they have to wait until the next reporting cycle to deal with it. You don't, and you probably should declare the structural change in the same year, then include a planned recalculation date. The earlier you signal it, the less it looks like a surprise later on. All right, this one is more interesting because it's about to hit a lot of you, whether you've engaged with it yet or not. This is probably where we're fielding the most questions right now. In this example, a retailer applies the new land sector removal standard for the first time. In their reported scope 3.1 is dropping 5%. Real world emissions, of course, haven't changed at all. What's happening? Short cycle biogenic CO2 from things like sugar processing, fermentation, biomass combustion, all those things in your supply chain, that gets reclassified. It used to sit inside your headline scope 3.1 number. Under LSRS, it moves into separate biogenic memo. Same emissions, but just a different bucket. I want to point out the trap here. If you're not paying attention, it looks like a reduction. Your number went down, but you didn't reduce anything. The boundary around what gets counted as the headline just moved. So the disclosure language matters. You cite LSRS adoption. You restate the base year under the new boundary because the comparison only works if both years are measured the same way. And you report the memo alongside the headline. That's not optional under LSRS, that's part of the compliance. The companies that handle this well will treat it as a heads-up moment with their board and their auditor. The ones who treat the 5% drop as a reduction are going to get that walked back during their audit, and that's going to be an uncomfortable conversation. All right, third one. As we've begun to see regulation shift in favor of primary supplier-specific data, there are more and more companies invest in gathering PCF information from their suppliers. HowGood's long-term partner, Ahold Delhaize, I see some of you on the phone, and one of the largest world retailers in the world, hello, just announced a major initiative to shift towards PCFs, which we can all expect to see the upstream effects of very soon. So let's say that as a result of this shift, a food manufacturer is running their own supplier engagement program. Over 3 years, they pull in vendor-verified primary data for many of their top 400 ingredients. Scope 3.1 here drops, say, 6.1%. Very specific example. Let's look at what's happening underneath that number, though. Cocoa went up, sunflower oil came down, skim milk powder came down, wheat flour didn't move. Same supply chain, same farmers, same factories, same volumes. But the picture sharpened in both directions, right? We just understand it a little bit better. The cocoa case is the one we're going to look at for a second here. The modeled PCF, the one we had before, assumed industry average conditions. The vendor verified data that we got back through this process revealed the actual sourcing exposure was worse. That's not a failure of the program. That's information you didn't have before, and the information that your competitors probably just still don't have. The same rule as the LSR scenario, this is a methodology update, full stop. You can't claim that 6.1% as a reduction, but you can and you should disclose it as a methodology refinement. Name the share of spend it covers and signal that better data as now powering your future reduction work, which is where we're going next. All right, let's look at the same company 12 months later. So after collecting all the primary data, the manufacturer goes back to their sunflower oil supplier and partners on a renewable energy program. The supplier's scope 1 and 2 emissions as a part of that drops 40%. That ripples down into the sunflower oil PCF. In that PCF, it goes from 1.4 down to 1.1, and the manufacturer's scope 3.1 comes down with it. This one, it's a real reduction. The mechanism is completely different from the last slide. Nothing methodologically has changed. It's the same vendor-verified PCF year over year. That's dropped because the supplier's behavior has changed. This is the conversation you want to be having with your board. And notice, you can't even claim this reduction unless you've done the work in year 1 to establish a vendor-verified baseline for that supplier. The methodology work that you've done in year 1 is what unlocks the credible reduction story in year 2. So when someone in your organization is asking, why are you investing in supplier engagement before you have a reduction story to show? This is the answer. The reduction story doesn't even exist until the data does. All right, let's put it all together. Here's a rule that you can keep in the back of your mind. A change in how you measure is never a reduction. A change in what is actually happening in your supply chain is. Okay, this table, this is the one that's important. Look at the left side. Of the 8 common ways your scope 3.1 number can change in a given year, 5 of them are methodology updates. 2 are reductions. 1, M&A, is structural and follows its own path. Most of you are going to live through at least 3 of these in the next 18 months. LSRS rollouts, supplier-specific data flowing in, maybe an acquisition, polygon data resolving the cocoa exposure like we just looked at. Your job is not to avoid them. They're going to happen. Your job is to classify each one correctly when it lands. So when you sit across from your auditor or your investor relations team or SBTi, you can defend exactly what happened, why, and which bucket it belongs in. Get this taxonomy right and rebaseline. It's a non-event. You can do it. Get it wrong, and your reduction story unravels the first time someone audits it carefully. Okay, let's shift over to taking action for a second. If this leaves you thinking we might need to rebaseline at some point, but I'm not sure we're set up to do it, I want you to take this away. There are 7 criteria that determine whether your provider can help with a rebaselining event when this happens. Let's just look though at the 3 in the bottom right. The first, data in the system, is the hardest, and it's where most providers are actually falling down. Portfolio coverage includes your long tail ingredients with methodology current to LSR and flag and the latest land use data change. And modeled PCF sitting in the same emission factor library as your vendor verified primary data. That's 3 high bars stacked on top of each other. The second, system outputs, is asking whether the same underlying calculation can answer every disclosure you owe today and 3 years from now. Multi-framework alignment to SBTi, CDP, and your largest retailer's question. If the system can't manage them all, you're maintaining parallel systems and calculations forever, and you don't want to be doing that. And the third, the larger network, well, that looks at the attributes of the partner you're working with and the larger community of companies in their network. Whether your partner truly understands food and agriculture as a category, whether you can produce the outputs you need to do at scale, and who else they're working with, whose footprint data you could potentially have access to. The landscape has changed dramatically. HowGood has leaned heavily into portfolio coverage, defensibility, and most importantly, the ability to fully integrate your model EFs with vendor-verified supplier-specific EFs. We believe strongly that a large network of food and beverage companies sharing data seamlessly will help everyone not only set accurate baselines, but also enable all of the decarbonization work that comes with setting that baseline. We approach rebaselining with our partners following a couple of different pathways, whether it's rerunning your base year with the same primary data and just updating land use figures in the grid mix, or full ingestion of new materials with updated primary data. At the end of the day, these are the decisions that your accounting team should own. They know your business best, and HowGood's role is to provide fully defensible data with whatever approach your team chooses. Okay, we're happy to answer any specific questions about our approach here at HowGood or capabilities in the Q&A at the end, so please drop any questions in the chat. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Eva and to really dive into some great questions and details with Kyra. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel. All right, so we're going to open things up for a Q&A. I'll kick things off just with a few direct questions for Kyra, and then we've already got really solid questions coming into the chat, so feel free to keep those flowing. All right, Kyra, you're in the hot seat. So just to start things off, we're seeing, of course, a real industry shift towards sort of more mature, more granular reporting. And that, of course, begs a lot of questions about how to approach rebaselining. So a lot of food companies are sort of facing this strategic choice. Do they invest in supplier-specific or polygon data before setting an SBTi target? They'll give them a more accurate baseline, but of course, there'll be a delay as they sort of get everything in place. Or do they set the target now? They've only got model data and then just sort of plan to rebaseline as all of their better data lands. I don't know if there's a better sort of recommended sequence from SBTi's perspective that you could speak to.
Yeah, so this may not surprise anyone, but coming from the SBTi, of course, we're going to recommend that companies set targets as soon as is feasible for them, right? There's a couple reasons for that, okay? One, obviously, we exist to enable corporate climate action, right? We want everyone moving as fast as possible, as soon as possible, for the sake of our planet, obviously. But in addition to that, I think we really, at the SBTi, I think what we really want from companies is this transparency. And I set my target now, right? I'm using model data. I expect that it will improve. I'm going to work in parallel. So on one track, I will be investing in the actions I know I can take now, right? We don't want perfect to be the enemy of good in this space. And I think that is what we get caught up a lot in. When we've been in this profession for a while, when we've been around for a while, we know we want accounting to be absolutely perfect, but sometimes it's not, right? And we have to make decisions and investments based on imperfect information or incomplete information. So we absolutely recommend, when it's feasible. And then the other thing I really want to highlight here actually is that we know that there are some real business benefits to setting targets, right? It's not just for the emissions reduction, which of course we want to enable. But we have seen that companies report some actual benefits that could help in obtaining some of that supplier data, right? So in December of last December, we released a report around kind of what the impact has been for companies setting science-based targets. Like, how is this affecting their supplier engagement? How has it affected their investor relations, et cetera? So we actually heard that there were some significant benefits of just the act and process of setting the target. And I've actually seen this. I was on the corporate side before I joined SBTi. And one of the reasons I wanted to join the SBTi is because I saw science-based targets in action in company boardrooms, okay? Seeing how it could lead to strategic cohesion, see how it could galvanize internal stakeholders towards a common goal, and how it could really inform some of the investment decisions being made. We know that it can truly kind of help steer companies all towards common objectives. And then lastly, I'll just say, we also know companies report improved investor relations, an accelerated pace of climate action generally once they've set a science-based target. So that is a very long-winded answer on, if you can, if your company, your board, et cetera, are comfortable with some degree of ambiguity, proceed and in parallel work towards that improved data over time.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Kyra. And we'll get that report actually and follow up when we send out the recording after the webinar. I think pretty much everyone on this call is always looking for fodder for moving folks internally towards sustainability investments. All right, so this is a question that has come up quite a few times, and actually even a similar question on our last webinar on land sector and removals, which is around sort of internal accounting timelines and how those line up with target submission dates. So it's a common scenario. We'll say a company finishes their carbon accounting in September. Their target submission is due in October, and they have over a 5% change. So there's obviously no time to sort of formally rebaseline before the deadline. What's the right way to approach submitting in good standing, sort of doing what they're supposed to do, but also signaling that there will be a future rebaseline? So what does SBTi expect? Like, what kind of action should they be taking?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple options here, and I'll actually let Iman as well jump in at any point as our SBTi. I don't know if we have someone from SBTi services here, which is very exciting. But essentially, I think there's two ways that a company could go about it, right? So and I'm assuming that this company is kind of going towards a commitment deadline. Perhaps they've set a commitment with the SBTi, so that would be a formal commitment that starts a 24-month clock. And if you fail to submit within that timeline, you get a slight ding on our target dashboard that says commitment removed, right? So there's kind of a couple options here. But one, I'd say if there is that kind of strong, whether there's a strong external deadline, i.e. you're getting a lot of investor pressure, you've already committed to setting this target by a certain time, et cetera, or you've already made a commitment with the SBTi and you're nervous about that commitment lapsing in our target dashboard and having to explain that whole process, I would counsel to go ahead and submit with the data that you have available at that time. You can always disclose when you've gotten that target validated, that you anticipate that you're still maybe going through some changes in methodology, you're still exploring or upgrading your data, et cetera. You're expecting that to change. But I don't know if we have anything specific on our end that you would need to disclose that in advance. Iman, is that correct from your end? I don't think we require any kind of heads up that, we're coming back to update our target soon. We're like, you can do that anytime. Anytime you want, you can come update your target for any, reason really.
I just want, sorry. I just want to add one clarification here is that if the rebaselining is triggered by structural changes being significant, so causing more than 5% cumulative change, then the SBTi applies a grace period. So the rebaselining must happen within at least 1 year after the completion of one reporting cycle after the structural changes happen. But if the rebaseline is triggered by methodological change, then there is no grace period because we assume that the data needed for that rebaselining from the methodological change is already readily available. So there is no grace period for that second trigger for the rebaselining.
Great, thank you, Aman. That's definitely a useful nuance there. So that kind of brings us into the question of reporting thresholds. I know that we've got some questions coming in the chat on this front too. The 5% threshold is mechanical, but target integrity obviously matters quite a bit too, and is really sort of the point of all of it. If your total inventory doesn't move 5%, but we'll say a single scope 3 category shifts more than that 5%, how does SBTi judge whether to require that rebaseline or not? There's sort of been talk of like, is there an unwritten rule about category level integrity that food companies should know? And I think it's especially important with scope 3 being such a large percentage of food and beverage companies' overall GHG inventory.
Yeah, I can start on this one. And then, of course, if there's any additional insights from services, since they work so closely with a lot of these things. But so first, I would say we do our absolute best to not have unwritten rules, although, of course, I'm sure there are things that occur, that we don't always document. But as a standard setter, I would say, we really strive to be crystal clear with anything that's written and, accurately designated as a requirement or recommendation. So, but kind of just going back to that presentation we saw, right? So the rebaselining is triggered from that total 5% across the inventory. So it'd be hard for me to imagine this scenario if like scope 3 is truly that significant for your company, that there wouldn't be some type of major change indicated here, right? And then the other kind of threshold mentioned is if that 5%, if there's a 5% change within that target boundary, right? So if scope 3, if you have that total covered by the target, you have a major change in category 1, I would imagine that you're meeting that threshold somewhere in there. But I think that, the ideal, right, is that if you do find kind of a significant improvement in accuracy, I think it's at the company's discretion if it's under our minimum threshold. But companies should, I know Greenhouse Gas Protocol recommends that companies kind of develop their own significance threshold for rebaselining and have that policy in place. So it's up to the company, right? If the company wants to say, if there's a 3% change, or if there is a significant change in one category or in one scope, that means we're going to rebaseline. Like they could go ahead and set that for themselves essentially and communicate that as kind of a position of leadership as well, right? Of saying like, no, we really want to make sure we're super accurate here. Here's the policy we're going to go forth with, and we're going to apply that in cases that maybe are above and beyond what the SBTi requires.
Great, thank you so much. There's a lot of sort of deep-seated concerns about restating your base year, whether there will sort of be a penalization or whatnot with those numbers when those numbers have changed. And a lot of this sort of comes from the fact that there is this sort of multi-body framework. So folks are not only doing carbon accounting for SBTi, but also for CDP, for their own auditors. So they're sort of answering to a lot of different players all at once. If you could speak to sort of how are the big four assurance providers handling methodology-driven rebaselining? We hear that even when your posture is clear, assurance teams sort of raise their eyebrows about restated figures, and I imagine you have some insight into this. So is SBTi coordinating with assurance bodies on this? And what really should sustainability leads be? What should they do when their assurance provider is sort of more conservative than your own framework? Any guidance you can give there, I think would be really appreciated.
Yeah, this one, so this is one where, so the SBTi currently, in our current criteria and standards, we actually do not have any particular requirements over assurance. So it is a best practice. It is fantastic that companies are pursuing that. But technically, at this time, we do not require assurance. However, that is subject to change. So as you probably know, if you are around this ecosystem, you're familiar with the SBTi, you probably know that we're in the middle of this huge project right now called the Corporate Net Zero Standard version 2. Within that project, we are developing kind of a more robust framework for assurance, i.e. what needs to be assured, what are the best practices, what are kind of the minimum requirements there, et cetera, what should assurance providers really know and stick to, et cetera. So that is all ongoing work at the SBTi. We expect that we'll have a lot more information on that, hopefully later this year. But for right now, I would say there are two things that a company could do here. One, direct the assurance provider that you're working with to our training and certification program. So we do have I want to say new, but it's really not. It's been at least like 6 months or a year. So we have a training and certification program. It's hosted over on the SBTi services website, I think. You can get there from science-based targets as well. But essentially that helps providers, consultants, et cetera, like upskill on the standards, on what SBTi actually requires. And then the other thing is that we maintain a list of SBTi certified experts. So those are folks that have taken kind of a robust training program. They've passed what I hear is a very rigorous test to ensure that they know our standards in and out. So that's another place that folks could look if they don't have someone already, contracted to provide those services. But those would be kind of what I recommend right now. And then if you have any additional questions on kind of the development of that work, definitely stay tuned. Make sure you're signed up for our newsletter, all of those things that you know when we do develop a bit more of a robust framework there.
Thanks, Kara. And that's another link that we can send out afterwards to that training. And any assurance providers here. Stay tuned. All right, so just to follow up on that question, and then we'll open up to our audience Q&A. I think I want to dive in just a little bit deeper for when the numbers come out higher. So it's very possible that after you rebaseline, the numbers will be higher than anticipated. And people sort of worry about like, are we penalizing the trailblazers? Are the people, the sort of like front runners, going to run into some trouble because they were fast movers? So we'll say a food company has the data to restate their baseline honestly, but the honest number turns out to be higher than what they originally published. And that we're sort of especially seeing that now with LSR guidance. And biogenics being removed from that inventory or sort of notated differently. Folks can worry that, this is like an admission of prior misreporting. So how should these folks be thinking about restating when it goes sort of upward? Where is there sort of straight from the source, your thoughts on what happens when that rebaseline results in higher emissions?
Okay, well, first of all, let me caveat this entire answer with I am not a communications professional. I am not a public relations professional. Okay, so certainly collaborate with the teams and the folks you pay to do those things, right? But beyond that, right, sitting as someone at the SBTi, we are always encouraging companies to really and truly the kind of North Star that we would like companies to aim for is transparency. Okay. And I know that's a buzzword. I know we hear it a lot. And some folks are like, what does that mean? Do we have to tell them absolutely everything? To some degree, yeah, we might recommend that. Okay. I think where companies get in trouble, quote unquote, where I've seen increased scrutiny for companies is when they omit critical details. what I've seen, I mean, as recently, I think as last week, we saw a company come through some LinkedIn feeds on, you know, to the extent the criticism was, okay, you didn't actually know anything about your supply chain, right? And I think when companies are transparent, when they do include some of those critical details, that's what fosters trust. Okay. And I think that's the main thing, right? Like you want to stay trustworthy as a company. And I think being open and transparent about, hey, we did the absolute best that we could with the best available data at the time, right? You were acting in with the best intent at the time, the data that was available, right? Data has improved. That necessarily will change numbers. Okay. And that's not a bad thing. As we've said kind of throughout this webinar, like that is not inherently a bad thing to have numbers changing, even if they look higher, right? It means that you actually do have a better grasp of what's truly happening on the ground. And that's something to celebrate, right? Because that means you can actually better direct action. So I think it is so much in the framing. It is approaching this with some level of honesty and humility. I think that is something that stakeholders desperately want from companies in this space, is some level of humility, the ability to say, oh, yeah, we didn't have that perfect at first, but here's how we're trying, here's what we're doing to improve, and here's our plan forward. That is what stakeholders want. And I think if you can kind of really hit those three things, obviously I can't guarantee that anyone will be above reproach or scrutiny, but I think that those things do a lot to foster trust across the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think goes to show this is an industry that is changing so rapidly. And probably all the folks on this call are ahead of the game, ahead of the ball. So that transparency and sort of shared learning feels particularly important here.
And maybe just a really quick add-on there, right? So if you are one of these first few companies that start to do this, right? Like you will not be alone for long, okay? Like as we've kind of seen, these things are coming down the track. A lot of companies will be doing this, okay? So if you're in that first mover space for a little bit and you're like, oh, this is uncomfortable, like where is everyone else? Where are all my peers here? Like, don't worry, they're coming, right? But
yeah.
you may have
Can
to
I
do
just
that.
step in on that too?
Sure.
Is we are seeing that, and we're really recommending that our clients who are engaging on this way, especially switching to DLUC for cacao or something like that, where you really might get hurt. That you trumpet it, that you say, we now know, and we know, and it's awesome. Nobody's tracking what the raw number was. Like nobody really is tracking that company by company. And so to say, we now know, it's a little higher than we thought it was, but we've got something to work with, and you're gonna see reductions year on year now because we're tracking the actual polygons. Talk about the polygons, talk about your knowledge of the supply chain. It is a win, and everyone will really read it as such. It's only that raw number and your internal conversations about that raw number, your conversation with your CEO and your board, who's expecting it to work like regular accounting, but it doesn't. But everyone outside of that is going to just be happy about it, and we see it work, right? You just have to go bold and clear and confident about what you're doing and why, and that you're killing it, and everyone's going to reward you for that. You're basically you're by definition not greenwashing in this moment. You're reporting a bigger number, so you're just winning. You're saying, "Hey, look what we're doing. We're talking about reality, and we're willing to prove that by reporting a bigger number. So reward us for that." And it works. We've seen 3 or 4 clients do it already with clarity and aggression, and it's been awesome.
Feel free to reach out to Arthur to join your next board meeting next time you're reporting on your emissions.
That's a new
Great.
service, Rachel.
I'll open up to some audience questions, and lots coming in. We'll get to as many as we can. So we get a lot of questions about double counting in general. So I want to start out with that. One question is, and Arthur and Aman, I think these will largely go to the two of you. Kyra and Rachel, feel free to jump in as well. Do you also need to rebaseline if a value chain partner is financing reductions in your value chain and claims this reduction themselves? The question is sort of, it can't be double counted, right? How would you go about accounting for that sort of in-setting arrangement? Arthur or
Sorry, did
Iman?
you say Arthur then Iman or Iman then Arthur?
Go for it, Arthur, and Iman can chime in as well.
Okay. So basically, if an offset or something like that is being sold, or an inset is being sold to another party in some way, then you can't claim it. This is the type of accounting that we actually hate and are trying to get away from as completely as possible. If a farm is removing carbon or is reducing carbon, or a processing center is installing solar or whatever, we want that to be accounted for and fully embedded in their accounting for their actual operations, which actually influences the emission factor, the PCF, of the complex material you're purchasing from them. And then it is part of your inventory. You should be claiming that. If for some reason they are selling it, which does happen, we talked to Rachel, you'll remember this. We talked to a large provider a long time ago who had installed methane capture at every one of their, I guess that would make it obvious who it was talking about, of every one of their farming operations of a certain type. And it was pretty impressive, but they were selling all of that off, right? So that's where it gets complicated. In that situation, yes, double counting. But if you are actually just pushing it into your supply chain, then you should be rewarded for it.
Great. Um, Iman, this question comes to you, and you responded in the chat, but I think it is sort of enough importance that I do want to call it out loud as well. Can you please re-explain the calendar rules for target updates?
Yes, so for any rebaselining that is triggered by structural changes that are significant enough to cause 5% or more, there is a grace period that is applied for the rebaselining itself to happen, and it is applied as 1 year after the company completes one reporting cycle after the structural changes took place. As you know from the example that I pasted in the response here, this applies differently whether the company is using a calendar year or a fiscal year, but the rule is the same. Once the company is successfully completing one reporting cycle after the event itself, then there is 1 extra year for them to actually rebaseline. So this is a grace period that is specifically applied to structural changes because the SBTi acknowledges how hard it is sometimes to acquire data from the mergers, acquisitions, its divestment, etc. But as I said previously, it is not attributed to any methodological changes or other triggers for rebaselining because we assume that the data will be more available in that second case.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And yeah, that will also be shared explicitly after this webinar as well. All right, we've talked a lot about getting sort of better, more granular data from your supply chain, but there's a question here about improvements in internal data. So how do you deal with changes like improvement in internal data? For example, you didn't have weight data available before, or your purchasing data was distributed across multiple systems, something that I'm sure we all know very well. So it's not that your internal data has improved, but you're not necessarily able to properly map this to the base year. What do you do? Arthur, you responded to this in chat, so I'll open it up to you, and then Aman, you can of course add in as well. So improvements to your internal data.
Yeah, so this really depends. If you have if your improvements to your internal data can be effectively backcast to those earlier years, then we can support you with a recalculation. If they can't, then we can talk about which year you can, which prior year you could use as a new base year, or where there are data gaps that we can help fill, or that you do have close enough data for that we can, let's say you don't have let's say now you have recipe data for every material you purchase, right? And we can calculate a PCF for that, and you only have that recipe data for 2024 and forward. But you know that your recipes haven't changed, and you don't know your sourcing or anything like that, but you do have your volumes for your purchase materials for 2020. We can use the recipe data to calculate a very good PCF for 2020 using 2020 grid mix and 2020 SLUC for all of the underlying materials. We're using 2024 recipe data, but that is, we can declare that in the report and so on. And so we can help you rebaseline for 2020 with the 2024 recipe data, 2020 SLUC, 2020 grid mix, and 2020 purchase volumes. I think I named all of those. And then then that's a perfectly good that's enough data to resubmit. Now, if your gap is actually in recorded purchase volumes or something like that, we can't really help you there, right? Like that's a problem. Maybe that shouldn't be your base year. There's those are adjustments that we can sort out on the fly and help you work with. But yeah, there are some data gaps we can't cross for you. But some of those data gaps we really can.
Perfect. Iman, anything else from your side on internal data improvements?
No, I think Arthur covered everything. Of course, the first choice would be to baseline, and there is a lot of method that the company can backcast data. There is no requirement to have primary data for the rebaselining exercise. But of course, if the data gaps are huge and it's impossible to backcast the whole inventory, then the second option would be to use a new, more representative base year.
Perfect. Thank you. Iman, I'm going to come back to you on this one. I really like this question from Tim. And then Arthur, you can fill in as well. In many cases, we transition from sector average PCFs, sort of category averages, over to supplier specific PCFs once carbon reduction efforts have already taken place. So they were not yet reflected due to the use of averages in the initial baseline. In such cases, the observed reduction may be driven both by a methodological change as well as an actual emission reduction effort. How would you recommend distinguishing and attributing the reduction between these two effects? Between these two effects, methodological change versus real decarbonization efforts?
I don't think there is an exact method to make that distinction. I think as long as the company strive to reach the ambition required and the minimum by the base year, and if there is any rebaselining that is required or change of the base year, it is attributed there, then there is no distinction between what is the reduction that needs to be attributed to the reduction themselves versus the methodological changes. But also this is why the 5% threshold comes in place to say that if it's the change is significant enough and it's not attributed to the reduction, it should not be counted as reduction. So that's why the rebaseline exercise is important there.
Arthur, anything you want to add regarding how HowGood approaches this?
I don't think so. I think Iman covered it.
Great. But either way, go ahead and start reaching out to your suppliers early so that you can start counting those reductions. All right, a question from Lauren that probably a lot of folks have on their mind. Is rebaselining a similar scale of effort or work as the original target validation process? Arthur and Iman are both giving a little smile to this. Arthur, do you want to go
I want
ahead?
to hear what Iman has to say. I have
All
my
right,
answer,
Iman, it's all
but I'm
yours.
biased.
I would say just the rebaselining exercise itself, so just recalculating base year emissions, or whether if that rebaseline is significant enough that it triggers a target update. Two different discussions, but the rebaselining exercise itself, I would not compare that level of effort to a normal resubmission. I mean, it depends also on what we talked about how significant the data gaps are there and how the backcasting of those changes is feasible or not. But overall, if that triggers a target update, then I would say it's the same level of effort because the company has to go through all those. It has to disclose the inventory and the updated target and pay a fee for the update, etc. So it is a considerable effort comparable to a normal submission, I would say.
All right.
I would just say, in terms of people who are nervous about it, when the update is all in one part of your inventory, so let's say everything else has stayed the same, but you are just recalculating and you're seeing the significant change driven by scope 3.1, And so that's where that's the only difference. We've seen the revalidation process just be a lot smoother because everything else, all the questions and answers and everything still stand for your scopes 1, 2, and 3.2 through 3.15, or maybe not scope 3.4. There's a couple of things, but if the only adjustment is in scope 3.1 and scope 3.4, even though it's technically the same process, everything else is likely to stand. Scope 3.1 is where you're going to get the inquiries. And if you're doing it with us, we're now backing you up on those. And we do this all the time, right? And so if you're using someone who's really, not just us, anyone who's really experienced in this, that revalidation is going to be the smoothest version of the validation process, even if it's technically the same process.
Mm-hmm. We've done the hard work of gathering all the data, at least, certainly. All right. A question from Jonathan. 5% is not much if we go back to when SBTi targets were set, maybe 2020 for many companies. Does this mean the majority of companies are rebaselining right now? Arthur.
I mean, honestly, if we could get a smooth path to it, we'd have everyone rebaselining every year because then there's no you're just seeing change driven by real change or real reductions in your business. That's what we'd want. I know that's crazy and not going to happen. We do have clients who commit to rebaselining, to revalidating their targets every 3 years. And it's an internal commitment, not public, but that's their expectation, their goal, and what their managers are expecting things to change based around that. It is part of they budget for it, and we love that because there is an expectation that you're always comparing like for like, and more than comparing like for like, that you understand that the state of the science is dramatically changing right now, year on year. The ability to calculate DLUC at scale across an otherwise impenetrable supply chain is now possible. That to do PCFs, I mean, I think we produced PCFs, 500,000 PCFs for the supply chain of one distributor a couple of months ago. And that wouldn't have been possible 5 years ago, right? So that switch from generic to specific and so on is just emblematic of all the changes that are happening. That not even to say like the changes in LCA availability for individual crops in individual locations with emission factors that should be reflected in your supply chain, right? So there is built-in change here. Right.
Yeah, the conversation around rebaselining, it's so much more common now than it was 12 months ago. So there are a lot more companies that are talking about rebaselining. It's becoming a regular occurrence, or even if they're not doing it now because they're a little bit nervous, they're having the discussion. We're talking about it every day now.
All right. Thank you all so much. We'll stop talking about it for today, or start talking about it internally. Iman, Kyra, especially, thank you very much for joining us. I know lots of folks here are really appreciative of hearing directly from the SBTi. Feel free to continue the conversation. Feel free to follow up by email. We'll be sending out a webinar recording and a couple of links of the assets and resources that came up during the day today. But if you've got questions that didn't get answered, definitely shoot us an email, and we're happy to continue the conversation with you directly. Thank you all again. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you to the folks asking questions and answering each other's questions. And we'll see you all on the next one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.